Marcus's day began the same as any other: a jarring alarm, a rushed cup of coffee, and half-hearted small talk with neighbors he'd never truly gotten to know. He was running late for work and pulled his coat around him against the unseasonably cold gust of wind. Everything about this morning felt off, as though the day had started too quietly and too loudly at the same time. He had barely turned the key in his car's ignition when the phone on the passenger seat started to ring. Marcus frowned. It was an unknown number. On any other day, he might have ignored it, but some irresistible pull made him pick up. A slow, ragged voice crackled through the line, whispering his name in a quavering hiss. Then came a warning, disconnected phrases that made little sense. Don't go. Watch the time. You aren't safe. Marcus's heart thumped against his ribcage. He demanded to know who was calling, but the line went dead. For a moment, he sat motionless, absorbing the electric charge in the air. Something about the warning felt personal, like it was targeted specifically at him. With a final glance at his phone's dark screen, Marcus put the car in gear, determined to brush off the unease. But as he pulled onto the street, the late autumn light seemed to cast strange shapes along the sidewalk. And from the corner of his eye, just for a second, he thought he saw someone standing still among the swaying trees, head tilted as though it were watching, waiting. He told himself it was just his imagination. He tried to focus on the road and forget the weird call. But deep down, Marcus already knew that his life had just taken a turn into the unknown, something sinister, with secrets waiting to be unearthed. And when his phone rang again not 10 minutes later, he couldn't help the cold sweat that prickled across his neck. Something was definitely wrong. Despite the creeping anxiety in his chest, Marcus forced himself to continue working. The second call came right after he parked. The same voice, low, husky, whispered in an unearthly whisper through the phone speaker. You weren't listening. The danger is near. Watch the glass. And then silence. Marcus felt as if his skin was covered with ice. Watch the glass? He looked through the windshield at the office building in front of him. Its windows seemed to glint in the morning light, the reflections distorted and shifted as if they held secrets that were beyond his reach. He shoved the phone into his coat pocket and walked toward the entrance, his heart pounding with every step. Inside, the lobby lights flickered, and the reflection in the large glass doors caught his eye. For a second, Marcus thought he saw someone standing right behind him, a figure with a pale face and empty eyes. He turned around, but the space was empty. When he looked back at the door, the flickering light made his own reflection distorted, limbs outstretched, head tilted at a strange angle, as if he were looking at a stranger. Overcoming a surge of panic, he hurried to the elevator. If he was imagining something, he had to get rid of it. After all, it was just another day at work, wasn't it? But somewhere in the back of his mind, that hoarse voice kept repeating, over and over, like a broken record, watch the glass, watch the glass, watch the glass. Marcus could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much darker descent. The rest of the morning dragged on in a tense fog. Marcus tried to immerse himself in spreadsheets and emails, desperately searching for anything that could bring him back to normal. But he couldn't ignore the restless energy tugging at his nerves. His phone was like a coiled snake in his pocket, silent for now, but ready to strike with another nightmarish call. It was noon, and the overhead fluorescent lights in the office were buzzing so loudly that his teeth chattered. He was so nervous that he barely ate anything, deciding instead to have another cup of coffee. That's when it happened. A colleague named Tim let out a sharp, frightened scream from across the room. Marcus turned around and saw Tim limping away from the conference room door. Tim's face looked haggard, and sweat was beading on his temples. When Marcus ran up to him, Tim stammered something about a reflection, a face in the glass, not me, looking right at me. Marcus's chest tightened. He peered through the glass panels of the conference room. For a moment, there was nothing but the standard reflection, rows of tables, blinding light, and the distorted outline of his own face. Then, for a split second, something shifted. The reflection of Marcus's face stretched out, his eyes seemed to fall into black sockets. Even as he blinked to try to clear his vision, the image morphed into a hideous smile that didn't match the neutral expression he knew he was wearing. He staggered, bumping into Tim, who flinched at the collision. The light overhead flickered. Cold sweat covered Marcus's palms as he remembered the warning he had heard earlier. Watch the glass. Watch the glass. Suddenly, the phone in his pocket buzzed. Once, twice, then 3 times, as if demanding his attention. Every instinct screamed at him not to answer it. But the more he ignored it, the more urgent the call became. Tim, still shaking, watched as Marcus finally dug out the phone. There was no caller ID on the display. With trembling fingers, Marcus pressed the screen. The same fragmented whisper filled his ear, almost too faint to make out. "It sees you. It's following you. Don't trust your reflection." Marcus shuddered violently. He clutched the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Was it possible that something otherworldly was speaking to him? What was looking back at him from every mirrored surface he passed? Tim reached for Marcus's shoulder, asking if he was okay, but Marcus barely heard him. He focused on the glass walls, half expecting some horrifying figure to break through. And as he stood there, his heart pounding like a war drum, he realized that the voice had said something else, something last, barely audible before the line went dead. "And you are running out of time." Marcus stumbled out of the conference room and headed for his desk, Tim nipping at his heels. His mind was filled with half-formed questions and fear. What was that thing in the glass? Who was calling him with these warnings? Was he going crazy, or was he really seeing something that defied human explanation? He sank into his chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. Looking around him, he noticed that the rest of the office had returned to its normal routine. People were typing, phones were ringing, and the intern was awkwardly balancing coffee cups as she passed him. But all Marcus could think about was his reflection, distorted into a hideous smile, and the icy voice on the phone. His gaze swept the room, lingering on any surface that reflected light: the shiny metal trash can, the polished marble floor by the elevators, the dark windows along the far wall. Each of them seemed to be looking at him, waiting for the right moment to distort him again. He forced himself to breathe, to calm down in the surrounding normalcy. But it was an illusion he could not sustain. A terrible weight was pressing on the back of his head, as if something was watching him, whispering quiet, poisonous thoughts. Closing his eyes, he saw a distorted face reflected in the glass. When he opened them, he was surprised to see it hovering right over his shoulder. Suddenly, the office door slammed. Marcus and Tim jumped as a gust of wind rattled the blinds. Someone muttered about a draft, but Marcus felt a deeper resonance in the noise, as if the building itself was shaking. The lights flickered on again overhead, casting staccato shadows that made his skin crawl. He realized that he was shaking slightly, so he pushed away from the table and gave Tim a look that said, "I need to get out of here." They retreated to a small break room at the end of the corridor, away from the main hustle and bustle of the office. The smell of stale coffee and leftover food from the microwave hung in the air. Marcus's head was throbbing, and he was dizzy from the adrenaline rush. Tim, pale and visibly nervous, kept looking at the door. "Whatever it was," Tim whispered, his voice shaking, "I know I saw it. I swear there was a face, something behind me in the reflection. But when I turned around, it was gone." Marcus swallowed hard. It happened to me, too. And I've been getting these calls." He hesitated, and then told Tim about the stranger's voice on the phone, the warning, the mention of the reflection. Saying these words out loud made them feel more real and more terrifying. "I don't know who it is," he finished, "but it knows things it shouldn't know. It seems to be guiding me, warning me." For a moment, they stood in tense silence, broken only by the faint hiss of the coffee machine. From time to time, the light overhead flickered, and each time Tim jerked his head as if expecting to see something terrible. Marcus's phone vibrated in his pocket again, sharper and more urgent than before. He pulled it out, wincing at the unknown caller ID. His fingers hovered over the screen. He was about to reject the call, but Tim placed a trembling hand on his arm. "Answer it," Tim said in a low voice. "Maybe we can find out what's going on." With a cold fear gnawing at him from the inside, Marcus took the call and put it on speakerphone. Immediately, the same fragmented whisper pierced the air. Only this time he was excited, and the words came out in fragments. "Closer. It's moving with you. Behind your eyes. Wait for the next sign." A sudden blast of static cut through the voice, and Tim took a step closer, his breath catching. They both strained to make out the words on the other end of the wire. They heard what sounded like a hiss, or perhaps heavy breathing. Finally, the voice came through again, clearer and louder than ever. "When glass breaks, it goes through." And then the break room was torn apart by a furious screech of feedback. Marcus flinched, almost dropping his phone. Tim covered his ears with a grimace. The piercing sound died down as suddenly as it had started, leaving them both in an uneasy silence. The call was over. For a long time, both men could not speak. Then Tim exhaled slowly, panic flickering in his eyes. The glass, We're on the 10th floor. Almost every wall here is made of glass or mirrors. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he stared at the dark screen of his phone, fighting the fear that threatened to consume him. Because deep down, he knew the terrifying truth. Whatever was hiding on the other side of that reflection was waiting, and time was running out. As soon as Marcus and Tim left the break room, the atmosphere in the office turned into something oppressive and suffocating. It seemed as if the walls themselves were silently moving, each pane of glass concealing dark intentions. The usual everyday hum of office life in the building turned into a tense silence as people whispered in anxious tones, frightened by the flickering lights and the sudden cold that swept through the corridors. Marcus's phone, hot on his leg, was silent. For a while, this brought him a terrible relief. He didn't want to hear that intermittent whispering anymore, but the silence seemed as ominous as the calm before a violent storm. They returned to Marcus's desk, acutely aware of every mirrored surface around them. Tim hovered near him, unconsciously biting his fingernail. "I think we should get out of here," he whispered. Marcus nodded, a whirlwind of half-formed plans swirling in his head. A voice warned them. When the glass breaks, he goes through it. His eyes darted to the nearest window. Although it was white light, the glass seemed disturbingly dark. He thought that something was peering out behind that glitter, a predator ready to pounce. They made their way through the maze of offices to the elevator lobby. The others in the office exchanged anxious glances, feeling an eerie tension but not knowing its source. Tim pressed the elevator button. Time slowed down as they waited for the call that seemed to never come. Marcus saw his reflection in the polished elevator doors. His face was exhausted and his eyes wide and uncertain. Would he see it again, that crooked smile, or the pale figure standing behind him? Finally, the elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open to reveal an empty car. Hesitating only a moment, they rushed inside. As soon as the doors began to close, the overhead lights in the elevator flickered sharply. They went out for a long, terrifying second, plunging the small space into darkness. Tim let out a strangled sigh. Then the lights flashed back on. Marcus's heart was pounding. He stared at the reflective metal walls and realized, to his horror, that the reflections did not correspond to their actual movements. Instead, they showed two pale, vacant-eyed figures standing completely still. Tim and Marcus were trembling, their hearts pounding, but their reflections stared unblinking, their faces twisted into silent smiles. The phone in Marcus's pocket buzzed again. Without hesitation, he pulled it out and took one look at the screen. As usual, there was no caller ID. He hesitated, but Tim's panicked look begged him to do something, anything. So Marcus answered. The voice on the other end was no longer just a whisper. It was a distorted chorus of hisses and gasps, as if several throats were speaking at once. "It's too late. It's coming. It's here." Interference crackled, then the line went silent. As if on cue, the elevator shuddered and stopped between floors, the overhead light flickering on so fast that it cast frantic, strobe-like shadows. Outside, something scraped against the metal doors, a slow, painful screech that made Marcus's stomach flutter. Tim pressed the open door button, but no one answered. The elevator shook, and Marcus's phone flashed an alarm. An emergency message, though the words were too encrypted and glitchy to read. The only thing he could make out was a single phrase that flashed on the screen for a moment before the display went blank. Breaking point reached. Suddenly, the overhead light went out completely. Darkness fell, broken only by the faint glow of the emergency lights. A faint, sickly glow glinted on the mirror panels, and Marcus caught his breath. One of the reflections, the one behind Tim, was no longer just a distorted image. It was a figure. Its skin looked ashen, and its mouth was a slimy, black cavity. Slowly, it raised its long, bony arm and pressed it against the glass. Although Marcus couldn't see anything from their side of the elevator, the reflection of that hand was pressing, as if looking for a way out. Tim saw it too. He screamed, stumbling backwards. Marcus grabbed him, trying to hold them both up, as a web of cracks suddenly crept across the mirror surface. The hand of the reflection was pushing outward, splitting the glass from the inside, as if the boundary between realities was being pushed apart. Each crack spread with a piercing, crystalline scream. They both rushed to the elevator doors, desperately trying to open them. The metal grate tore under their desperate hands. Inch by inch, they pushed through a gap just big enough to slip through, but the elevator was stuck between floors. Tim, his face white with terror, climbed out first, pushing against the edges of the opening. Marcus followed him, pushing until he could slide to the floor above. A brief second before he kicked out, the elevator made a terrifying noise, the sound of shattering glass and a piercing scream that seemed inhuman. Marcus saw something black and distorted appear through the broken glass, like a living shadow with fingers like claws. With all his strength, he kicked off with his foot, wrenching the reflection from his hands, which clung to his pant leg. Then he broke free and fell to the floor next to Tim. The light flickered overhead, and an eerie silence reigned in the corridor. The low hum of static filled the air, resonating in Marcus's ears. He and Tim jumped to their feet, their adrenaline pumping. Whatever had broken through the elevator mirror, whatever had grabbed him was still down there, or perhaps already out in the building. As they stumbled down the corridor, they could see the broken windows in the offices they passed, shards of glass shimmering on the carpet like ice crystals. The flicker of movement in those dark glare made their hearts beat faster. A colleague was sitting at the table, in tears and shaking, pointing with a trembling finger at the broken windows. Through them, the sky outside looked strangely dull, with a hint of bruise color. Something primal and terrifying whispered in Marcus's mind. He knew that what was happening was not limited to one elevator, one office, or even one building. The phones, the warnings, maybe they weren't just for him. Were other people across the city, country, world, receiving similar calls, preparing for the same unbridled horror that was slipping through their reflections? A violent crash caught their attention. Down the corridor, glass partitions exploded outward as if they had been smashed from the inside. Shadows flickered in the swirl of debris. Marcus grabbed Tim by the arm and pulled him toward the emergency staircase. Each step was like fighting through a nightmare. They plunged into the entrance, slamming the door behind them. Plunged into the semi-darkness, they heard distant screams echoing from below, where frantic footsteps thundered down the stairs. Marcus's phone rang again, but this time Tim snatched it out of his hands and answered in a shaky voice. "Hello," he mumbled. "Who is this?" Silence. Then a single breath, long and hissing, as if someone or something on the other end of the line was savoring their desperation. Finally, the voice spoke, clearer than ever before and full of a bizarre, eerie glee. "You have been warned. You now belong to the reflection." A deafening roar echoed through the walls of the stairwell. The door behind them cracked, kicked in by a force that defied explanation. They raced down, flight after flight, hearts pounding and lungs burning. Once Tim lost his footing and almost fell face first down the stairs, but Marcus pulled him up in time. When they burst into the lobby, their legs gave out. The windows that lined the building's facade were shattered, and something black like tar was seeping through the broken glass. It shuddered like living ink, or an ocean of shadows in constant motion. Beyond the threshold, the daylight outside turned into anxious twilight. People who had managed to escape the building were running aimlessly down the street, some clutching bleeding cuts from shrapnel, others staring in horror at any surface that reflected light, car windows, puddles of water, even the screens of their phones. Marcus sighed heavily and met Tim's eyes. The thunderous pounding in Marcus's chest threatened to crush him, but he set his jaw. They had two choices: stay inside, where a hideous presence loomed behind every mirrored crack, or risk what was behind the building's broken windows. Tim pressed his hand on the lobby door, forcing it open. An unearthly cold rushed in, carrying the smell of ozone and something rancid. Meanwhile, creeping shadows licked the edges of the broken glass, stretching into snake-like tendrils. Without a word, they rushed out into the street. Screams and sirens filled the air. The glass crunched underfoot, reflecting the frantic flickering of the fires already burning in the distance. Marcus's phone lay forgotten in Tim's hand, its screen cracked and flickering. In the uneven reflection of that cracked screen, Marcus saw a last, horrifying face, sunken eyes and razor-sharp teeth, before the device shattered and died. They fled the building, but the world around them changed forever. The phone calls and warnings were only the beginning. Now, as glass shattered all over the city and eerie figures slipped through the reflective curtain, Marcus realized that there would be no return to normal. The last call echoed in his mind. "You have been warned. Now you belong to the reflection." He and Tim walked away from the chaos, nightmarish images haunting them in every random reflection. And when dusk fell, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that reality itself was cracking, splitting into something dark and predatory, hunting in the mirror's glare. No one knew how to stop it. No one even knew what it was. But as the shadows slipped through the broken glass, swallowing up everything that had once been familiar, Marcus realized one thing with heartbreaking certainty. The warning had come too late. The horror that lived in the reflections had been unleashed, and nothing in this world, not a phone call, not a desperate escape, not a last, frantic prayer could keep it from spreading its nightmares until everything and everyone was consumed.